In this segment, we're going to take a look at how to assemble the radio. Get all the components together. This section is going to focus primarily on a lot of the mechanical assembly, which there really isn't that much. Just a few areas that are tricky, such as the fabric over the speaker grills. So without any further delays, let's dive right in. For the fabric, I'm fortunate enough where I have a wife who is heavily into the fiber arts. She's into quilting, knitting, cross-stitching, weaving, all those wonderful things. And a while back she bought this fabric, and it was for a cross-stitch experiment, and apparently it didn't work out. The thing she didn't know when she bought this, it was the perfect fabric for covering our speaker grills. I think if I were to look through the historic photos of radios, we'll probably find this fabric covering speaker grills on some radio somewhere. So I'm extremely fortunate in that regard. Obviously, I can't really source this for you because it was a while ago and she probably picked it up in a small shop somewhere. But find a fabric that fits your needs, and to attach it to these grills, I'm going to use this double-sided tape. This comes in various widths. This appears to be about 6 millimeters, quarter inch roughly wide. I did a quick sample here, and while I can remove the fabric, it does have good adhesion. And really all we need is for it to be there moderately secure so that we can cut out these holes after the fabric is on, and then have the fabric stay there while we put this inside the radio housing. So we don't need super bond or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is cut up some strips of this, put them around the peripheral and around these holes, maybe on the inside edges. Might run one across the grill area here, and from there we'll go ahead, put the fabric on there, press it on, and we'll trim it up. Now what you want to do with your fabric is make sure that you keep your orientation the same as when you cut it, so that there's consistency in the weave and the nap of the fabric. And don't get one side up and one side down. That can create, actually this goes this way, a different texture as well. So make sure you keep everything the same between the two pieces. So with that, the next thing that you want to do is when you put it over your grill, for example, this particular edge is the bottom of the radio, or on the bottom side. Now you don't want your fabric at some random angle. Do your best to lay this on there so that you're perfectly aligned, or that the weave is perfectly aligned with one edge or the other. And I'm going to go this way. So this is going to be tricky, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to fold over an edge lined up with the weave, and then use that as my baseline, like so. And then with that, I'm going to push it on there, flip it over, try to get a decent adhesion on there. And then I'm going to repeat this for the other piece, for the rounded one. Process will be the same, just have to, when you go to press it on, you'll roll it like so across the flat surface. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and trim it up. You can trim it tight to the outer edge all the way around, except for one area on this piece, and that's this area right here. Now that was cut back to provide clearance for the HDMI connector. That'll be in this area. So it's really, really close to the edge of the hole that's on the front of the radio. So I would recommend leaving maybe even as much as 1/4 of an inch in this area. Maybe just cut straight up like this and then follow along the peripheral. Otherwise, there's a good chance you'll be able to see right inside the radio in a very, very tiny gap there. So just go ahead, trim that up. Nobody's really going to see this edge, but you might as well try to make it look as nice as you possibly can. Now, a very hard part that you got to do, depending on your fabric, with a loose weave like this, it's really tricky because it'll want to continue to fray on you. So use a very, very sharp penknife and then cut out that hole. You don't want any fabric that can get caught on the inside of here, and as you push it over those pegs, it might draw it in and get a run in your fabric. So take your time on this step, cut those holes open. And this is what they should look like with everything trimmed up nice and neat. Don't worry about these exposed outer edges here. That area is hidden by the front of the radio housing anyhow. Now, one thing I want to clarify, if I didn't make it clear earlier on when I was talking about the assembly section here, the speaker mounts are 3mm and the LCD screen mount are 2mm. So don't try to get the 3mm stuff in this small hole that's here. The next thing is, before you finish it, you really should make sure you've got a good fit in this groove area here over the base. If you try to force it, you're going to scratch the surfaces here and here. So having a good fair amount of clearance on there will make this pop on and fit much, much nicer with less chance of scratches and so forth. So you should be able to just pull it on, draw it back, and that is it. Now at this point, I'm going to put a few drops of glue, probably super glue, back in these areas here. Just a few drops, doesn't need much to hold these two pieces together. After that, I'm going to clean out these areas of the wax and so forth, both here and here. That'll be where I'm going to mount that vertical trim piece. Again, I'll use super glue there, and I'll use super glue on the bezel. Few drops of glue in here, and that's all it should really take to hold this piece on. Again, super glue. I use the thicker variety. The vertical trim piece that catches in these two square holes here and here. Again, a few drops. I've gone through and scraped away the paint in those little grooves, and that should help create a good bond for these pieces. bezel will go in here, and as I fit this earlier, everything should be pretty easy. So I've sanded out this inside edge, so I'm going to try to get a few drops of glue on there. And we'll put this in. Now I realize everybody thinks super glue is instant, but what I've learned with gluing PLA plastics is it does take a while for a bond to occur. So I like to just leave things sit now for about 15 or 20 minutes. The speakers that I've selected for this radio are Sony XS GTF 1027. Of course, there'll be a link in the information for this project. Now, the one thing you got to watch out for, because of the curved shape of the radio, one tab has to be bent out of the way. And see how I've done that there? And I just taken a pair of pliers and bent that up out of the way. Now, if you got a different brand of 4-inch speaker, you may have to cut. Maybe you can just bend it just as easily as this one did, but you'll have to address that situation. So to install the speaker, what we're going to do is use 3mm by 12mm screws, and I may need to put washers on them. I'm going to see where the screws actually fall with relationship to the slot, and I think we'll be okay with that. On second thought, I'm going to put washers behind here. So give me a minute to find those, and I'll be right back with you. Well, I didn't have the perfect size washers, but I think these will suffice for the situation. Now we just get that down in there. And again, these are 3mm by 12mm long screws. So I'll just run these down and get them good and snug. Now the other speaker is a little bit trickier. The grill, because it goes in at an angle, it's kind of hard to get it to go down nice and square. Just kind of work it down gently. Then again, 3mm by 12mm screws backed up with a washer. And you don't need to bend off the tab on this one. You've got clearance on all 4 points. Now for speaker wire, I'm using 18 gauge wire. It's multicolored, red and black, doesn't really matter. But as you can see, I left nice long legs on it. They're going to be a nuisance until we get everything assembled, and then I'll cut them down to size so that they're serviceable but not overly long. Next up, we'll try to install the LCD panel. Now for the display, to mount that in here, we're going to use 2mm by 6mm screws. You might be able to get away with 8s, but I think they'll be too long. 4s will probably be too short. Now you'll see that we've got a right angle adapter here on the display, and that's so that if we put a regular HDMI cable in there, a straight one, it'd end up going through the speaker over here. And of course that isn't possible. So I found this right angle adapter, and it's kind of a pretty standard size, I'm hoping, and this should work out good. And then I've got a right angle USB cable here as well. You see here it's right angle, and then on this side it's normal. Now again, 2mm by 6mm screws is what's going to hold that in. Now As I mentioned before, if you want to go 2.5 millimeters, you'll probably be able to get a threaded insert to fit in the holes down on the inside here, but it is designed for 2 millimeter. Oh, don't drop that. And I'll just carefully bring this down, set it in place, and then I'll tighten up those screws. Oh, I forgot one very important step. Like all displays, you got to take off the protective film. Oh, isn't that exciting? Now we can install our rotary encoder switches. Obviously at this point, it doesn't matter which one's which, but what we need to do is, because there's so little clearance along this bottom edge, and we've got to make sure that we get the anti-rotation tab in that extra little hole there. Now on your final version, I might try to put a couple of slots, one at 90 degrees, or at 90 degrees to this, and then a vertical slot for this anti-rotation tab to fit in. That gives you a little bit more freedom as to which way you want to mount it. But in any case, if you're going down like mine, you'll have to pull the wires off to the side like so, and then drop that down in the hole. We'll attach a nut onto the other side. Fuck! Now putting on the knobs, you got to pay a little bit of attention here. Now these knobs have a set screw, and that's usually to clamp on the flat of a shaft. Now these rotary encoders don't have that flat, and they're also split. So what you want to be careful of is when you put this on here, for example, this is where my set screw is, and I want it to be lined up with the slot. I don't want it to be 90 degrees to the slot, because that'll just pinch this closed and the knob will fall off. So we'll take that, line it up like so, and then snug it up. Now if you can find a better knob, there's nothing wrong with that. I've got, these are the ones that I could find that would work. Certainly not the right kind for this type of encoder shaft, but they will work and they will last for a very long time. We're getting very near the end of the assembly now. One thing that I probably should have done before I got this far along is to insert the captive nuts that are 3 millimeter in the electronics rack here. Getting them in now, and maybe even putting a dab of super glue on them so that they stay put, is probably not a bad idea. Especially in that center one down in there. It's going to be harder to get that one in with the more stuff that I put on here. Now as far as connecting to the Raspberry Pi, obviously we've got a double row header pin on there. And DuPont connectors are the type of connector that work well with them. Now I have the crimping tools and the components to make up my own ends. As a maker, especially if you're tinkering a lot, I highly recommend you get that ability. Buy the crimper. The crimper tool I don't recall being that expensive, and the pins and the plastic housings are not that expensive either, and you can buy them in kits off of Amazon. Now the advantage to that is if you can make up your own like this. In this case, I've got 5 wires from my encoder, and I goofed up and actually used a 6-pin housing for it. When you put this on, of course in the appropriate place, they're much more stable than just having one put on each pin individually. These can come off more easily. These just simply have the unified friction of all 5 pins. And it makes it much easier to put it on and connect it. However, if you don't have that option available to you, you can buy pre-made wires with DuPont connectors on both ends. On the end that you would solder, just cut the end off and strip away the wire, solder that in place, and then connect the loose end or the DuPont end to your Raspberry Pi. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect both my left and right encoders, which are the volume and the tuner encoders. So we'll get those in place, and that pretty much buttons up this area, which means we're really close to being able to mount our electronic enclosure or electronic assembly into the base of the radio. This here's my volume connector. That starts at the very end of the Raspberry Pi. Then we're going to have a few open pins, and then the next connector will go in place. And that'll be for the tuner. Okay, now we've got the tuner connector in there. Again, if you're counting my pins on the video, just remember I've got a 6-wide connector and not a 5-wide. Now we can trim our speaker wires to a suitable length. I'm allowing enough slack so I can have the whole electronic assembly out here. So my speaker wires are going to go about like this. Now when we get this all assembled, we need to dress these wires or tie them up with wire ties and so forth. Speaker wire that I'm using is 18 gauge. Anything close to that should do the trick. And of course, try to remember hook positive up to positive. They are marked on the speaker which terminal's positive, and on the amplifier board. So I'm using red wire on positive, black wire on negative. Working our way through the rest of the connections, we're down to the HDMI and possibly rerouting the audio. Now originally I had the audio set up with the right angle over on the side, on the amplifier side, and then the straight plug on the Raspberry Pi. But in reality I just switched those around. Now I got my right angle in the Raspberry Pi. And what I'm going to do with this, I had to get a right angle adapter. Those of you that were complaining about the Raspberry Pi 4 having the micro-sized HDMI connectors, well, in projects like this, those micro ones are a whole lot easier to route around things. So I needed to get a right angle adapter, and of course I'll have a link for that. And I'm going to have that pointing this way. The link that I'll be providing where you can purchase this, you'll actually get two. One with pointing to the left, one pointing to the right. But we'll have it go that way, right over the top of the audio cable. And then from there, we can put the HDMI cable in this orientation. That should all fit inside the back of the radio. And now looking at it from this direction, you can see how everything's going to fit in there. It's very tight against the display near the back. In fact, the USB cable may have to reroute that so it comes up and over the HDMI cable. But the other connectors and cables, you can pull those out, tie those off as needed. The speaker wires can be looped over themselves and tied back as such in a short loop. Same thing over here. Just tie them off to a short loop. You don't want them next to something where they're going to vibrate and rattle. That's the thing you want to try to do as you dress your cables in to tidy them up and, of course, to prevent rattling and that sort of thing. So with that, I can run the screws up through the bottom, tighten up our electronics bracket, and from there, Everything else I'll be doing with the Raspberry Pi is done through VNC from a Windows computer, so there's a good chance I'm going to seal this baby up. Now, one thing that may need to happen with this radio, and we won't know until after I play it for a while and see how it sounds, we may need to add some foam padding in here. That's done a lot in acoustical boxes or speaker boxes. The general term for it is that it makes it sound better with more bass. It's a more dead sound. You still get your high frequency stuff, but you get a little bit better strength out of the bass on it. So we'll deal with that later if needed. Early tests are, it sounded really good when I first powered it up, so I'm pretty happy with that. So I just may go ahead and button this baby up. Okay, buttoning up the inside assembly. I'm going to be using 3mm by 12mm button head screws. Socket head cap screws would work as well. And if you don't have 12s, perhaps you have 10s, that'll probably work just as well. I would recommend putting 5 screws in the bottom as planned, just to help prevent any vibration and rattling. Alright, and we're going to use some wire ties to dress these wires and keep them off or away from the walls or anything so that they don't create any rattles. And you can route them any which way that you see fit. I don't know if you can see in here or not. I'll take a flashlight to try to help with it. But the USB cable that goes over to the display, I routed that, I unplugged it from the Raspberry Pi and routed that in front of the HDMI cable back in here. And it just had less strain on it, and it wasn't pinched as bad over in this area here. Alright, now with that, I think we're ready to button it up. Now with everything tidied up nice in there and the cable's dressed, we can install the back. That's held in place with 3mm by 16mm long screws. 12s might work, but I don't know if you'll actually catch the captive nut or not. It just kind of depends on how well everything's going to work in your favor. Well, that wraps up this segment. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.